The kick landed hard enough to echo off marble. Nixera Vale, once the smallest Omega in the Frostvale pack, hit the polished mall floor on her side, breath ripped from her lungs. A crystal ornament shattered beside her, red baubles skittering like spilled blood across white tile. Laughter rippled through the gathering crowd. Phones lifted, screens glowing as strangers angled for the perfect shot. No one stopped the man in the black suit who loomed over her, foot still raised, eyes cold with recognition. "Move," Dorian Cade sneered, his voice carrying across the atrium. "I don't have time for trash." Nixera didn't cry out. She curled inward, one arm over her head, the other steadying the pharmacy bag that had torn open when she fell. Pills scattered across the floor, white capsules rolling into the cracks between tiles. Her calm was unsettling, wrong for an Omega everyone remembered as broken. She looked past him, not at him, as if she were counting something only she could see. Security didn't rush in. They never did when Money wore a tailored jacket. 3 years. It had been 3 winters since Dorian Cade stood before the Frostvale Pack Tribunal and declared Nixera Vale unfit to bear his mark. She could still feel the snow beneath her knees, the way her breath had misted in the frozen air as the pack elders circled her like vultures. Dorian had stood beside her sister Aloan that night, his hand possessive on Aloan's lower back while he recited accusations that tasted like rehearsed lies. Infidelity. Disobedience. Failure to submit to her alpha's authority. The charges were fabricated, every single one of them, but no one had cared about the truth. Omegas didn't get trials. They got judgments. Nixera had bled that night, the heat bond severing so violently she'd collapsed in the snow. Her own mother, Lyris, had turned away. Aloan had smiled. And Dorian had walked away without looking back, leaving her there to freeze or survive on her own terms. She'd chosen survival. The bus ticket to Seoul had cost $47, everything she had left after Dorian emptied their joint account. She'd arrived in a city where no one knew her name, where the scent of her broken bond didn't mark her as damaged goods. She'd waitressed, cleaned laboratories, slept in hostels that smelled like disinfectant and desperation. And then one night, in a restaurant where she served businessmen who barely noticed her existence, 3 men had tried to rob the place. Seojin Hanol had been sitting in the corner booth, perfectly still, perfectly aware. When the first man grabbed Nixera and pressed a knife to her throat, Seojin had moved. She'd never seen violence that precise, that controlled. Within seconds, all 3 men were on the floor, and Seojin was holding a napkin to the shallow cut on her neck, his dark eyes scanning her face with an intensity that should have terrified her. "You didn't scream," he'd said in Korean, his voice low and curious. "Screaming doesn't stop men like that," she'd answered in the same language, her accent rough but functional. He'd smiled then, a small thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, it doesn't." That was how it started. Not with rescue, not with dominance, but with recognition. 2 people who understood that survival required more than hope. It required strategy. Now, standing in the Riverside bus station 3 years later, Nixera felt the weight of that choice pressing against her ribs. She'd told Seojin she could do this alone, that she needed to face her past without the shadow of his protection looming over everything. He'd agreed because he trusted her, because their bond was built on respect rather than submission. But he'd also made her promise to call if anything went wrong. She hadn't expected to need that promise so soon. Riverside looked exactly as she'd left it. The same tired buildings, the same judgmental faces, the same air of small-town superiority that suffocated anyone who dared to be different. Nixera adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag and walked through streets that had once felt like home. Now they felt like a graveyard of the girl she used to be. Her grandmother Rosa was dying. That was the only reason Nixera had come back, the only force strong enough to pull her into this place that had tried so hard to destroy her. Rosa had been the single voice that defended her during the tribunal, the only person who'd whispered "run" when everyone else demanded submission. Now Rosa lay in Riverside General Hospital, her body finally giving up after 87 years of fighting battles no one else acknowledged. The hospital room was on the 3rd floor, tucked away in the corner where the fluorescent lights flickered and hummed. Nixera pushed open the door to find her mother already there, perched on the edge of a plastic chair with the practiced posture of someone performing grief rather than feeling it. Lyris looked up when Nixera entered, her expression flickering between surprise and something harder to name. "You came," Lyris said, her voice carefully neutral. "I came for Grandma Rosa," Nixera replied, setting her bag down by the door. She moved to the bed where her grandmother lay sleeping, machines beeping a steady rhythm that sounded like borrowed time. Rosa's hand felt impossibly fragile when Nixera took it, skin like paper over bird bones. "She's been asking for you," Lyris continued, standing now, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt. "She doesn't have long." Nixera nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The last time she'd seen her grandmother, Rosa had pressed $200 into her hand and told her to disappear before Dorian decided broken wasn't enough, before he decided dead was better. That money had bought the bus ticket, had kept her fed for the first week in Seoul. The door opened again and Aloan walked in carrying coffee in a cardboard tray. Nixera's sister had always been beautiful in the way that demanded attention, all sharp cheekbones and calculated charm. Now she looked polished, expensive, wearing jewelry that caught the light and a designer bag that cost more than Nixera used to make in 6 months. Aloan stopped when she saw Nixera, her perfectly shaped eyebrows rising in theatrical surprise. "Well, look who decided to show up." "Aloan," Lyris said, a warning in her voice that lacked any real conviction. "What?" "I'm just surprised." Aloan set the coffee down, her movements deliberately casual. 3 years of silence, and now she waltzes back in like nothing happened. Like she didn't abandon all of us. Nixera turned slowly, meeting her sister's eyes with a calm that made Aloan's smile falter. "I didn't abandon anyone. I survived." "Survived." Aloan laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. "Is that what you call running away? Still playing the victim, I see. Some Omegas never learn their place." The words were designed to wound, to drag Nixera back into the role of the small, frightened girl who'd once believed love meant enduring pain. But that girl was gone, buried somewhere between Seoul and here, between who she'd been forced to be and who she'd chosen to become. "Where did you get that bag?" Nixera asked quietly, nodding toward the designer leather that probably cost $3,000. "And that bracelet. Mother's salary doesn't cover Cartier." Aloan's hand moved instinctively to her wrist, covering the gold links. "That's none of your business." "Gifts from Dorian?" Nixera pressed, watching her sister's face. "Or payment?" Lyris stepped between them, her hands raised in a gesture of false peace. "Girls, please. Your grandmother is right here. This isn't the time." But Nixera had already seen the truth in Aloan's eyes, the flash of guilt quickly masked by defiance. Her sister had profited from Nixera's destruction, had taken what should have been evidence of betrayal and worn it like trophies. "I need some air," Nixera said, grabbing her bag. She kissed Rosa's forehead gently, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and old books. "I'll be back, Grandma." Outside the hospital, Nixera pulled out her phone and stared at Seojin's name in her contacts. Her finger hovered over the call button, pride and practicality warring inside her chest. She'd promised herself she could handle this alone, could face her past without hiding behind his power. But the walls were already closing in, the old patterns trying to reassert themselves. She typed a message instead. "I'm here." "It's harder than I expected." His response came within seconds. "Say the word and I'm on the next flight." "Not yet. I need to do this." "I know. But remember my heart. You're not the same person who left. Don't let them convince you otherwise. Nixera read the message 3 times, letting the words settle like armor around her bones. Then she pocketed the phone and started walking, needing distance from the hospital and the memories that clung to its walls like smoke. She ended up at Riverside Mall without consciously choosing the destination. It sprawled at the edge of town, all glass and chrome, trying desperately to look modern while everything inside stayed exactly the same. This was where Dorian had proposed to her 5 years ago, down on one knee in front of the fountain while a crowd gathered and applauded. She'd been so young then, so convinced that being chosen meant being loved. The mall was decorated for Christmas now, garlands draping from the ceiling and oversized ornaments hanging at intervals that probably tested some structural engineer's calculations. Nixera walked through the main entrance, her footsteps echoing on marble that gleamed under 2 bright lights. She needed to pick up Rosa's medication from the pharmacy, something for pain that the hospital couldn't provide quickly enough. The pharmacy was on the 2nd level, past the fountain where couples took selfies and children threw pennies with their eyes squeezed shut. Nixera kept her head down, not wanting to be recognized, not ready for the questions and the judgment that would inevitably follow. She'd almost made it to the escalator when a voice stopped her cold. Nixera Vale. Her real name, spoken with such contempt that it cut through the ambient noise like a blade. Nixera turned slowly, already knowing who she'd see. Dorian Cade stood 20 feet away, flanked by 2 pack enforcers in matching black suits. He looked exactly as she remembered, all sharp angles and calculated charm, the kind of alpha who'd learned early that dominance was easier than earning respect. His dark hair was styled perfectly, his suit expensive enough to announce his status to anyone paying attention. And his eyes, those cold blue eyes, locked onto her with the focus of a predator who'd spotted wounded prey. "I thought I smelled something familiar," Dorian said, loud enough that shoppers began to notice. Desperation and failure. A signature scent. The enforcers laughed, right on cue. Around them, a crowd was forming, that peculiar human instinct to watch conflict unfold from a safe distance. Phones came out, angling for position, ready to document whatever came next. Nixera felt her heart rate slow, her breathing steady. This was the moment she'd been preparing for without realizing it. Every therapy session in Seoul, every morning she'd chosen to get out of bed despite the weight of her past. She straightened her spine, meeting Dorian's gaze without flinching. "Dorian," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "I'm just here to pick up medication for my grandmother. I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" He laughed, moving closer with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "You were always trouble, Nixera. Running away, spreading lies, trying to destroy my reputation. And now you have the nerve to come back here? To my territory?" "It's not your territory," she replied calmly. "Riverside belongs to the Frostvale Pack. You're just a member, Dorian. Same as everyone else." His expression darkened, that familiar flash of rage that used to precede his worst moments. "You always had a smart mouth. Someone should have taught you to keep it shut." "Someone tried," Nixera said softly, deliberately. "It didn't work." The crowd murmured, sensing the history beneath the words. A woman near the fountain whispered to her companion, loud enough to carry. "Isn't she the Omega who accused him of abuse? The one who ran away?" "She lied about everything," someone else said, confident in their certainty. "Everyone knows she was sleeping around." He dodged a bullet. Dorian's smile widened, feeding off the support. "You hear that? Even after 3 years, they remember what you really are. A liar. A disgrace. An Omega too damaged for any decent alpha to claim." Nixera felt the words land, felt the old shame trying to claw its way back into her chest. But something had changed in her, something fundamental that Dorian couldn't see. She'd spent 3 years learning that her worth wasn't determined by who claimed her, that strength didn't require validation from people who'd chosen cruelty over truth. "I'm not here for your approval," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here for my grandmother. That's all." She turned to walk away, to remove herself from the situation before it escalated. But Dorian wasn't finished. He never was. "Running again?" he called after her, his voice dripping with mockery. "That's all you know how to do, isn't it? Run and hide and pretend you're better than what you are." Nixera kept walking, her hands clenched around the strap of her bag. The pharmacy was just ahead, 30 feet, and she'd be away from him, away from this moment that tasted like old nightmares. Dorian's hand clamped around her wrist, yanking her backward with enough force that she stumbled. Pain shot up her arm as his fingers dug into the delicate bones, his grip brutal and possessive. "I'm talking to you," he snarled, close enough now that she could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. "You don't walk away from me. Not then, not now, not ever." "Let go," Nixera said quietly, looking at his hand rather than his face. "Make me." His grip tightened, and she felt something in her wrist grind together. "Come on, show everyone that fire you supposedly have. Or admit you're still the same pathetic Omega who couldn't handle a real alpha." The crowd had grown, a semicircle of spectators with phones raised and expressions ranging from concerned to entertained. No one moved to help. No one told him to stop. This was pack business, alpha business, and humans and wolves alike had learned not to interfere when dominance was being established. Nixera met Dorian's eyes then, really looked at him for the first time since he'd appeared. She saw what she'd always seen, insecurity masked as strength, cruelty disguised as authority. He needed her fear the way other people needed air, needed to prove his power over someone smaller, because he'd never figured out how to be powerful in any way that mattered. "You're nothing," she said softly, just for him. "You were nothing then, and you're nothing now. And deep down, you know it." His face went white, then red. The hand on her wrist released only to shove hard against her shoulder, sending her stumbling backward into a display of Christmas ornaments. She caught herself against the edge of a table, glass spheres rocking and rolling, several falling to shatter against the marble floor. Red and gold fragments scattered like evidence. "Dorian, maybe that's enough," one of the enforcers said nervously, finally recognizing that this was crossing lines even pack law wouldn't ignore. But Dorian was past caring, past the careful mask he usually wore. Nixera had touched something raw in him, had called out the truth he spent every day trying to bury. He advanced on her, his body language aggressive enough that several people in the crowd finally started to back away. "You want to know why I left you?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at you. Weak. Pathetic. On the ground where you belong. This is what you are, Nixera. This is all you'll ever be." Nixera pushed herself upright, one hand pressed to her side where she'd hit the table's edge. She could feel the bruise forming, could taste copper where she'd bitten her lip. But she didn't lower her eyes, didn't curl into herself, didn't give him what he wanted. "Move," Dorian said, his voice cold with finality. He drew his foot back, and for a moment Nixera thought he was just posturing, just threatening. But then his boot connected with her ribs, the impact hard enough that she heard it echo off the marble floor. She went down, breath exploding from her lungs, white stars bursting across her vision. The pharmacy bag tore open completely, pills scattering across the floor like dice. A crystal ornament shattered beside her head, red baubles skittering like spilled blood across white tile. Laughter rippled through parts of the crowd. Phones lifted higher, capturing every second. Someone wolf whistled. Someone else said, "Damn, he really showed her." Nixera curled inward, one arm over her head, the other wrapped around her ribs. The pain was sharp and immediate, stealing her breath, but underneath it was something else. Something cold and clear and absolutely certain. She wasn't the same girl who'd left Riverside broken and bleeding. She'd survived worse than this. She'd rebuilt herself from nothing, had learned what real strength looked like when it wasn't performed for an audience. And she'd made a promise to someone who actually deserved her trust. Dorian loomed over her, foot still raised like he was considering another kick. "You always loved being seen like this," he said, pitching his voice for the cameras. "On your knees. Where trash belongs." Nixera's eyes finally met his. They were gold, bright and clear and completely, utterly calm. Not the dull submission of an Omega accepting her fate, but something else entirely. Something that made Dorian's triumphant expression flicker, just for a second. A hush rippled through the crowd. Not because of the color of her eyes, though gold was rare enough to draw attention, but because of the weight behind them, the absolute absence of fear or shame or any of the things Dorian needed to see to feel satisfied. Omegas didn't look at alphas like that. Not unless they'd learned a different kind of power. Behind Dorian, the automatic doors at the mall entrance slid open. The sound was ordinary, background noise that should have gone unnoticed. But something changed in the air, a pressure drop like before a storm, and every wolf within 100 feet felt their hindbrains sit up and take notice. Nixera inhaled once, slow and deliberate. The scent reached her first, cutting through the mall's artificial air and the crowd's mixed pheromones. Cedar smoke, steel, winter rain, and underneath, something older, something that made her wolf settle and her heart steady. He was here. Dorian felt it a second too late, his attention still focused on Nixera, on the satisfaction of seeing her down. Then a hand settled on his shoulder, the touch gentle and precise, and carrying an unmistakable command that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to instinct. "Remove," said a voice with a Korean lilt, calm and measured and absolutely inflexible. "Your hand." Dorian turned, fury flaring hot and immediate. Who did this person think they were, interrupting his moment, interfering in pack business? The anger died in his throat before it could form words. The man before him wore a three-piece suit cut to perfection, dark charcoal that probably cost more than Dorian made in 6 months. His hair was slicked back, revealing a face carved from elegant, brutal lines. High cheekbones, a jaw that could cut glass, and eyes that were a wolf's night, ancient and measuring and faintly, dangerously amused. Behind him stood 6 men in black tactical suits, perfectly still, perfectly coordinated. On their lapels, a sigil gleamed silver and unmistakable. A moon devouring a star. The mark of the Hanol Syndicate, the most feared shadow network in the Eastern Territories. Whispers ignited through the crowd like dry grass catching fire. "Is that? Oh my God, the Azure King. Hanol. That's the Hanol heir. What's he doing here?" Dorian's enforcers had already dropped into submissive postures, heads down, shoulders rolled forward. Instinct overriding loyalty, their wolves recognizing an apex predator and responding accordingly. But Dorian himself stood frozen, caught between rage and the first creeping edge of something that might have been fear. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking on the last word. The man didn't answer him. He looked past Dorian as if he were a minor obstacle, his entire focus shifting to Nixera on the floor. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened, warmed, became almost unbearably gentle. "Are you hurt, my heart?" he asked in English, his accent precise and careful. Nixera pushed herself upright slowly, ignoring the pain in her ribs, the scattered pills around her. She met his eyes and felt everything inside her settle into place, every fractured piece of her past clicking back together under the certainty of his presence. "Not anymore," she said quietly. The man turned back to Dorian then, and his expression returned to that carved neutrality that was somehow more threatening than any display of anger. "You kicked my wife." The word detonated through the mall like a bomb. Wife. The crowd's murmur rose to a roar, phones frantically typing, people pushing closer or backing away, everyone trying to process what they were hearing. Dorian laughed. It came out too loud, too fast, edged with hysteria. Your wife? She's an Omega. She's nothing. Nixera stood straighter, her hand still pressed to her ribs, but her voice carrying clearly through the space. I am Nixera Vale Hanol, bound by moon and blood to Seojin Hanol, Alpha King of the Azure clans. The name hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Seojin Hanol. Everyone knew that name. In wolf circles, in criminal networks, in the corridors of power that shaped territories and determined fates, the Hanol family was legend. They didn't rule through pack law or political games. They ruled through precision, through loyalty earned rather than demanded, through a reputation built on delivering exactly what they promised, whether that was protection or destruction. And the Alpha King himself, Seojin, was known for exactly three things. His brilliant strategic mind, his absolute intolerance for disloyalty, and the fact that he'd remained unbonded for 32 years despite every Omega and Alpha in the Eastern Territories throwing themselves at his feet. Until now, apparently. Dorian stumbled backward, his face cycling through disbelief, denial, and finally landing on something approaching terror. No, that's not possible. She's nobody. She's broken. She's Dash. Enough, Seojin said softly, and Dorian's mouth snapped shut. Not from respect, but from the weight of command that pressed down on every wolf in the vicinity, making them acutely aware of exactly where they stood in the hierarchy. Outside the mall, sirens began to wail. Not the local police, but something else. Federal vehicles, black SUVs with tinted windows, pulling up to the entrance with practiced coordination. Pack enforcement agents emerged, followed by men and women in suits carrying badges that identified them as internal affairs. The crowd began to scatter, survival instinct finally overriding curiosity. But Dorian stood rooted, watching his world unravel in real time as agents moved past Seojin's enforcers with careful respect and headed directly toward him. Seojin smiled then. It was not kind. It was the smile of someone who'd known exactly how this would play out, who'd been moving pieces on a board Dorian hadn't even known existed. Federal warrants for Dorian Cade, one of the agents announced, holding up documentation. Charges include fraud, assault, falsification of Pack tribunal records, and conspiracy to commit identity theft. Dorian's face went gray. What? No. I have immunity. My family's connections, Dash. Your immunity was contingent on certain conditions, the agent continued, flipping through papers. Specifically, the absence of credible evidence contradicting your testimony regarding the Valle incident 3 years ago. That evidence has now been provided by Dash. Me, Nixera said, stepping forward despite the pain in her ribs. She pulled a small envelope from her bag, handing it to the agent. 3 years of documentation. Medical records, therapy sessions, witness statements from Seoul. Every piece of evidence I gathered while I was away. Everything that proves what really happened. The agent nodded, accepting the envelope. Thank you, Mrs. Hanol. This corroborates everything your husband's team has already compiled. Dorian's eyes went wide, snapping to Seojin. You've been investigating me? Since the day my wife told me her story, Seojin replied calmly. I found it interesting how many inconsistencies existed in the official record. How many witnesses suddenly couldn't remember what they saw. How much money changed hands in the weeks following the tribunal. He paused, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate precision. I particularly enjoyed tracing the $50,000 that went from your family's account to various members of Nixera's family. Payment for cooperation, I believe. For silence. In the crowd, near the edge of the dispersing spectators, a woman's face drained of all color. Eloan Vale stood frozen, her phone buzzing insistently in her hand. She looked down at the screen, and Nixera watched her sister's carefully constructed world crumble in real time. Warrants. Subpoenas. Asset freezes. All bearing Eloan's name. Eloan's eyes met Nixera's across the space, and for the first time in their lives, Nixera saw something other than contempt or jealousy in her sister's expression. She saw recognition, understanding, the sudden, terrible awareness that she'd miscalculated, that the girl she'd helped destroy had somehow become untouchable. "Take him," Seojin said quietly to the agents. As hands closed around Dorian's arms, he began to scream. Apologies tumbled over threats, promises mixed with accusations. He screamed Nixera's name, begging her to tell them it was all a misunderstanding, that he loved her, that her sister had seduced him, that none of this was his fault. Nixera didn't flinch. She stood beside Seojin, her hand finding his, their fingers interlocking with the ease of practice. She watched Dorian being led away, watched the man who'd once made her believe she was worthless being reduced to exactly what he'd always been beneath the expensive clothes and practice charm. Small, scared, powerless. The mall fell silent except for the buzz of phones and the whisper of shocked conversations. Someone dropped their coffee, the sound of ceramic shattering unnaturally loud in the stillness. Seojin turned to Nixera, his hand coming up to cup her face with infinite gentleness. "You were supposed to call if you needed me," he said softly, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I know," Nixera replied, leaning into his touch. "But I needed to face him first. Needed to prove I could." "And did you?" "Prove it." She smiled then, small and genuine and utterly certain. "I'm still standing." "You are," he agreed, his own expression softening. "You always have been." Behind them, agents were cordoning off the area, collecting evidence, taking statements. Eloan had disappeared into the crowd, but Nixera knew she wouldn't get far. Not now. Not with Seojin's resources and the weight of federal attention finally turning toward the people who'd escaped justice for too long. Seojin's lead enforcer approached, bowing slightly. "The vehicle is ready, sir. The medical team is standing by." "I'm fine," Nixera started to say, but Seojin's look stopped her. "Your ribs are bruised at minimum, possibly cracked. You'll see the doctor." His tone left no room for argument, but his hand remained gentle on her face. "Please." She nodded, too exhausted suddenly to protest. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind pain and a bone-deep weariness that came from finally letting someone else carry part of the weight. They walked toward the exit together, Seojin's hand on the small of her back, his enforcers forming a protective perimeter that no one dared cross. The crowd parted without being asked, people pressing themselves against storefronts and columns, making a path wide enough for royalty. Because that's what she was now, Nixera realized. Not because she'd married power, but because she'd survived long enough to reclaim her own. The girl who'd been kicked and called trash was walking out of Riverside Mall beside the Alpha King, her head high, her eyes clear, her worth finally, undeniably visible to everyone who'd once looked through her like she didn't exist. At the entrance, Nixera paused. She turned back, looking at the fountain where Dorian had once proposed, at the floor where she'd just been kicked, at the faces of people who'd watched her suffering and done nothing. "This is who I am now," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the space. "Remember it." Then she walked out into the December evening, leaving Riverside and everyone in it to finally understand what they'd lost when they'd tried to break her. The automatic doors closed behind them and the mall erupted in chaos. But Nixera didn't hear it. She was already gone, already moving forward, already home in the only way that mattered. Seojin's hand tightened around hers as they approached the waiting vehicles, and she felt the last piece of her old life fall away like shed skin. She'd come back to Riverside as Nixera Vale, the abandoned Omega everyone pitied or scorned. She was leaving as Nixera Vale Hanul, Luna of the Azure clans, bound to the most powerful alpha in the Eastern Territories. But more importantly, she was leaving as herself. Whole, healed, and finally free. The SUV's interior smelled like leather and the faint trace of Seojin's cologne, cedar, and something darker that Nixera had never been able to name. She sat in the back seat, her hand still clasped in his, watching Riverside blur past the tinted windows. The city looked different from this vantage point, smaller somehow, less capable of hurting her now that she was leaving it behind again. Seojin hadn't spoken since they'd left the mall, but his thumb traced slow circles on the back of her hand, a gesture of comfort he developed in their first months together when her nightmares had been so frequent that sleep felt like enemy territory. He was waiting, she knew, for her to process what had just happened, to find words for the emotions churning beneath her carefully maintained calm. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quiet in the vehicle's hushed interior. "For coming. You don't need to thank me for that." His eyes remained forward, watching the road, but his grip tightened fractionally. "I promised I would always come when you needed me. That's not something that requires gratitude." "I know, but I wanted to do this alone. I wanted to prove I could face him without hiding behind you." Now he did turn to look at her, his dark eyes scanning her face with that intensity that still sometimes took her breath away. "And did you? Face him?" Nixera thought about the moment before Dorian's boot had connected with her ribs, the way she'd looked at him and seen him clearly for the first time. Not as the alpha who'd defined her worth, not as the man who'd convinced her she was broken, but as exactly what he was. Small. Cruel. Desperate to feel powerful because he'd never learned how to actually be strong. "Yes," she said. "I did. And then he kicked me, and I realized something." "What?" "That I don't have to fight every battle alone to prove I'm strong. That accepting help isn't weakness. That you standing beside me doesn't diminish what I survived to get here." Seojin's expression softened, that rare vulnerability showing through the mask he wore for the rest of the world. "You've always been stronger than me, my heart. I just have better resources." She almost laughed, but the motion pulled at her ribs and turned the sound into a sharp inhale. Immediately, Seojin's hand moved to her side, hovering without touching, his jaw tightening. "How bad is it?" "Bruised, probably. I don't think anything's broken. We'll know for certain in 10 minutes. He pulled out his phone, typing a message with his free hand. "The medical team is already set up at the hotel. You had them waiting." It wasn't a question. "I had them waiting the moment you told me you were coming back to Riverside. I trusted you to handle yourself, but I'm not an idiot. I knew the possibility existed that someone would try something." The SUV pulled up to the Riverside Grand Hotel, the nicest accommodation in the city by default rather than genuine luxury. Seojin owned it. Nixera had learned 3 months into their marriage when he'd casually mentioned purchasing several properties in her hometown. Not because he'd needed them, but because he'd wanted her to have safe places if she ever chose to return. "You bought an entire hotel as a contingency plan?" she'd asked, somewhere between amused and overwhelmed. "I bought 3 hotels, 2 apartment buildings, and a medical clinic," he'd corrected. "Contingency plans require redundancy." Now, stepping out of the SUV and into the hotel's private entrance, Nixera felt the weight of that kind of protection settle around her shoulders. Not suffocating, not controlling, but present. Solid. The kind of safety that came from someone who understood that protection meant preparation, not restriction. The penthouse suite took up the entire top floor, all floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture that screamed expensive taste. A woman in scrubs waited near the windows, her medical bag already open on the glass coffee table. She looked up when they entered, her expression professional and carefully neutral. "Mrs. Hanul," she said, gesturing to the cream-colored sofa. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. Your husband asked me to examine you. May I?" Nixera nodded, settling onto the sofa with Seojin's help. The doctor was efficient and gentle, her hands careful as she probed Nixera's ribs, checked her pupils, examined the bruises already forming along her side. Jean stood nearby, close enough to be present, but far enough to give the doctor room to work, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that would have looked relaxed to anyone who didn't know him. Nixera saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw worked as Dr. Chen catalogued each injury. 2 ribs are bruised, not fractured, Dr. Chen announced after several minutes of careful examination. You'll be sore for about 2 weeks, possibly 3. I'm prescribing pain medication and anti-inflammatories. Ice for the first 48 hours, then heat. No heavy lifting, no strenuous activity. She pulled out a prescription pad, scribbling quickly. The bruising will get worse before it gets better. That's normal. If you experience any sharp, stabbing pain when breathing, or if you develop a fever, call me immediately. Those could indicate complications. Thank you, Doctor, Jean said, his voice returning to that calm neutrality he used for business. Bill everything to my personal account. Dr. Chen packed her equipment, handed Nixera the prescriptions, and left with the kind of discretion that suggested she was very well paid for asking no questions. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Nixera and Jean alone in the vast suite. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jean moved to the windows, looking out over Riverside's modest skyline, his hands in his pockets. Nixera watched him, reading the tension in his frame, the carefully controlled anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. You're furious, she said quietly. Yes. At me? No. He turned then, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. At myself. For letting you convince me to stay away. For not being there when he put his hands on you the first time. That wasn't your fault. We weren't together then. We hadn't even met. I know. Logically, I know that. He crossed the room, kneeling in front of her so they were eye level. But seeing him standing over you, seeing the cameras, the people laughing, watching you on that floor. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. I wanted to kill him. Still do, if I'm being honest. But you didn't. No. Because you asked me not to. Because you wanted justice, not revenge. Because you're better than me in ways I'm still learning to understand. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. But it took everything I had to walk past him without breaking every bone in his body. Nixera's hand covered his, holding it against her face. Thank you for choosing what I needed over what you wanted. That's love, Jean. That's what makes us different from them. He kissed her then, soft and careful, mindful of her injuries, but needing the contact, the reassurance that she was here, whole, his. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. I'm supposed to protect you, he said roughly. That's what an alpha does for his mate. You did protect me. You investigated Dorian, built a case, brought federal agents when I needed them. You protected me by giving me the tools to fight back, not by fighting for me. She smiled, small and genuine. That's the difference between you and every alpha I've ever known. You understand that protection isn't about control. His phone buzzed, breaking the moment. He glanced at it, his expression hardening. The agents want to know if you're well enough for a preliminary statement tonight. I can tell them no. No, I'll do it. The sooner this is finished, the better. You're sure? I'm sure. I want this done before Rosa. She couldn't finish the sentence, but Jean understood. Her grandmother was dying, and Nixera needed to close this chapter before she had to open the next one. The agents arrived an hour later, 2 of them in dark suits carrying briefcases full of documentation. They set up at the dining table, recording equipment arranged with practiced efficiency. Jean sat beside Nixera, his hand resting on her knee beneath the table, a steady presence as she recounted 3 years of pain in clinical detail. She told them about the first time Dorian had hit her, 2 months into their relationship, his fist connecting with the wall beside her head before he'd apologized with tears and promises. She described the pattern that followed, how the violence escalated slowly enough that she'd convinced herself each incident was an anomaly, that she was somehow provoking him, that if she just tried harder to be the Omega he needed, he'd stop hurting her. She explained the night of the tribunal, how she'd been called before the pack elders without warning, how Dorian and Aloan had stood together presenting evidence of her supposed infidelity. Text messages she'd never sent. Photos that had been doctored. Witnesses who'd been paid or threatened into lying. I had no defense, Nyxera said, her voice steady despite the memories clawing at her composure. No one would listen. My own mother stood silent while they tore apart my heat bond. The pain of that severance almost killed me. I woke up in the snow 3 hours later, alone, bleeding, and realized that staying in Riverside meant dying. The agents took notes, asked clarifying questions, cross-referenced her testimony with the evidence Jean had already provided. By the time they finished, 2 hours had passed, and Nyxera felt hollowed out, exhausted from reliving trauma she'd worked so hard to process. "Thank you, Mrs. Hanol," the lead agent said, packing up his equipment. This testimony, combined with the medical records and witness statements from Seoul, gives us everything we need to proceed with prosecution. Mr. Cade will face significant prison time. What about my sister? Nyxera asked quietly. Aloan. She was involved in all of it. We have warrants for Ms. Vale as well. Fraud, conspiracy, identity theft. She'll be charged as an accomplice. The agent hesitated. I should tell you, we've been tracking her for the past 6 months. Her involvement goes deeper than just the tribunal. She's been selling information to rival packs, using your family name and your former connection to the Frostvale pack to gain trust before betraying confidences. Nyxera closed her eyes, a wave of something too complicated to name washing over her. Not surprised, exactly. Aloan had always been ambitious, always chasing status and power through whatever means presented themselves. But hearing it confirmed, learning that her sister had turned betrayal into a business model, still hurt in ways Nyxera hadn't expected. She'll try to contact you, the agent continued. She'll apologize, make promises, try to convince you to intercede on her behalf. I strongly advise you not to engage. I won't, Nyxera said. She made her choices. Now she gets to live with the consequences. The agents left, and Jean ordered food from the hotel restaurant, appearing with covered dishes that smelled like comfort despite Nyxera's lack of appetite. They ate in companionable silence, the kind of quiet that came from people who'd learned each other's rhythms well enough that words weren't always necessary. Nyxera's phone buzzed. Once, twice, 5 times in rapid succession. She picked it up, already knowing what she'd find. Messages from her mother, from old pack members, from people she hadn't spoken to in 3 years, suddenly desperate to reconnect now that they knew she was connected to power. You're famous now, Jean observed, watching her scroll through the notifications with growing disgust. I'm infamous. There's a difference. She opened a news app, and her own face stared back at her from the screen. The headline read, Disgraced Omega Revealed as Azure Luna, the Nyxera Vale Story. The article was surprisingly thorough, walking through the timeline of her relationship with Dorian, the tribunal, her disappearance, and her re-emergence today at the mall. Someone had leaked video footage from the mall, edited to show Dorian's boot connecting with her ribs, her calm expression as she looked up at him, and Jean's arrival seconds later. The comments section was chaos. Half the people called her a liar, an opportunist who'd trapped a powerful alpha through manipulation and was now trying to destroy an innocent man's reputation. The other half called Dorian everything from a monster to a cautionary tale, praising Nyxera's strength and celebrating her upgrade to a better mate. They're making me into a character, Nyxera said softly, scrolling through think pieces and hot takes from people who'd never met her. Not a person. A symbol of something they want to be true. Does it bother you? Yes. And no. I spent 3 years invisible and part of me liked it that way. But another part. She set the phone down. Another part is glad people are finally paying attention. Not to me specifically, but to what happened. To the fact that Dorian got away with it for so long because people chose not to see. Seojin pulled her against him, careful of her ribs, his chin resting on top of her head. The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon if you still want to do it. But we can cancel if you've changed your mind. No. I want to do it. I want to tell my story in my own words before someone else decides what it means. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other, while the city beyond the windows slowly lit up for the evening. Nixera felt herself drifting, exhaustion finally catching up to adrenaline, when a new notification lit up her phone. This one wasn't from a news outlet or a distant acquaintance. It was from Aloan. Please, Nixera. We need to talk. I can explain everything. Nixera stared at the message, feeling nothing. 3 years ago, those words would have hooked into her, would have dragged her back into the cycle of hoping her family might finally choose her. Now they just felt empty, a manipulation so transparent it was almost insulting. She's already trying, she murmured, showing Seojin the screen. Do you want to block her? Not yet. I want to see how desperate she gets first. It was petty, maybe, but Nixera had earned the right to a little pettiness. She set the phone aside and let herself sink into Seojin's warmth, into the certainty of his presence, into the knowledge that she'd walked into her past and emerged not just intact but vindicated. Tomorrow, she would face cameras and questions and the world's judgment. Tonight, she could rest. Sleep came easier than expected, her body finally giving in to the pain medication and the safety of Seojin's arms. She dreamed of snow and blood and tribunals, but this time when she woke in the frozen dark, she wasn't alone. Seojin was there, solid and real, pulling her back from the memories with gentle hands and whispered reassurances. I'm here, he said, the words he'd learned to say when nightmares gripped her. You're safe. You're home. And this time, finally, she believed him. Morning arrived too quickly, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows like an accusation. Nixera woke to find Seojin already dressed, standing at the windows with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapid Korean to someone on the other end. His tone was sharp, authoritative, the voice of the Alpha King rather than the gentle mate who'd held her through the night. He ended the call when he noticed she was awake, crossing the room to sit on the edge of the bed. How do you feel? Like I got kicked by an angry alpha, she said, attempting a smile that came out more like a grimace. Every breath pulled at her bruised ribs, and the painkillers had worn off enough that movement required conscious effort. The press conference is in 4 hours. My team has prepared talking points, but you don't have to use them. You can say whatever you want, or nothing at all. We can still cancel. I want to do it. Nixera pushed herself upright, accepting Seojin's help when her ribs protested. I've spent 3 years silent. That ends today. The hotel's ballroom had been transformed into a professional press conference setup, complete with a podium bearing the Azure clan sigil, rows of chairs filled with journalists, and cameras that would broadcast everything she said to countless screens across the territory. Nixera stood backstage, wearing a midnight blue dress that Seojin's stylist had delivered that morning, her hair pulled back to expose the bond mark on her neck where Seojin had claimed her 6 months ago in a private ceremony. You're beautiful, Seojin said, adjusting his tie in the mirror beside her. And you're going to be brilliant. Or I'm going to freeze up and humiliate both of us. Impossible. You walked back into the place that tried to destroy you, faced the man who abused you, and stood up in front of everyone who'd called you a liar. A press conference is nothing compared to that. A production assistant knocked on the door. 5 minutes, Mrs. Hanul. Nixera took a deep breath, feeling the pull in her ribs, the ache that served as a reminder of exactly why she was doing this. Then Seojin's hand found hers, their fingers interlocking, and she let his strength flow into her like shared breath. They walked out together, the cameras flashing before they'd even reached the podium. Seojin stood slightly behind her, close enough to be present, but positioned to make it clear this was her moment, her story, her voice that mattered. Nixera stepped up to the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces, at the journalists poised to dissect every word, at the cameras that would carry her testimony into homes and offices and pack halls across the region. For a moment, the old fear tried to claw its way back, the instinct to make herself small, to apologize for taking up space, to defer to stronger voices. Then she remembered Dorian's boot connecting with her ribs. She remembered 3 years of rebuilding herself from nothing. She remembered every Omega who'd been told they were worthless, every victim who'd been called a liar, every person who'd survived abuse only to face judgment instead of justice. She spoke. My name is Nixera Valhanol. 3 years ago, I was publicly shamed, abused, and abandoned by the Frostvale Pack after my mate at the time, Dorian Cade, falsely accused me of infidelity to cover his own betrayal. Yesterday, he assaulted me in Riverside Mall in front of dozens of witnesses. Today, he's in federal custody facing multiple felony charges. Her voice carried clearly through the ballroom, steady despite the emotion threatening to crack her composure. I'm not here to ask for sympathy. I'm here to tell the truth that was taken from me 3 years ago. She detailed the abuse systematically, clinically, refusing to soften the edges or protect anyone's comfort. She described Dorian's manipulation, the way he'd isolated her from anyone who might have helped, the escalation from emotional cruelty to physical violence. She explained the night of the tribunal, the fabricated evidence, the Pack's willingness to believe a charming alpha over a scared Omega. I was taught that being an Omega meant accepting whatever treatment alphas decided I deserved. That survival meant silence. That love was supposed to hurt, and if I just tried harder to be better, smaller, quieter, he would stop hurting me. Nixera paused, letting the words settle. I was wrong. And everyone who taught me that was wrong. Being an Omega doesn't mean being worthless. Survival doesn't require silence. And love should never, ever hurt the way Dorian hurt me. A journalist raised her hand. Mrs. Hanol, some people are saying you're only coming forward now because you have power and protection. That you're using your connection to the Azure King to destroy a man who rejected you. How do you respond to that? Nixera had expected this question, had prepared for it, but hearing it spoken aloud still sent anger flashing through her chest. I documented everything the moment I was safe enough to do so. Medical records, therapy sessions, witness statements from people in Seoul who had no connection to either Dorian or the Frostvale Pack. I built my case over 3 years, not 3 days. The only thing that changed yesterday was that Dorian made the mistake of assaulting me in public, on camera, giving me the final piece of evidence I needed. She leaned forward, her eyes finding the journalist who'd asked the question. As for using my connection to my mate, yes, I absolutely did. Seojin gave me resources, protection, and the ability to pursue justice without fear of retaliation. That's what a good mate does. That's what love actually looks like when it's not twisted into a weapon. Another journalist stood. What do you say to your sister, Eloan Vale, who's been implicated in the conspiracy against you? Nixera's expression hardened. I say that she made her choices knowing exactly what she was doing. She chose to sleep with my mate while he was abusing me. She chose to help him fabricate evidence against me. She chose to profit from my suffering. Those weren't mistakes. Those were calculated decisions, and now she gets to face the consequences. Do you forgive her? No. The word came out flat, final. Forgiveness isn't owed to people who aren't sorry. Eloan isn't sorry she hurt me. She's sorry she got caught. There's a difference. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, each one designed to find cracks in her story, to paint her as vindictive or opportunistic or any of the other labels society reserved for women who refuse to suffer quietly. Nixera answered them all with the same steady calm, neither apologizing for her survival nor claiming to be anything more than a person who'd endured the unendurable and chosen to keep living. Finally, the moderator called for a final question. A young Omega in the back row stood, her voice shaking slightly. What would you say to other Omegas in situations like yours? The ones who are still trapped, still scared, still being told they're worthless. Nixera felt her throat tighten, emotion finally breaking through the careful control she'd maintained. This question mattered more than all the others combined, because this was why she'd come back, why she'd faced Dorian, why she was standing here exposing her wounds to strangers. I would say that you're not worthless. You never were. The people hurting you are trying to convince you otherwise because your strength terrifies them. They know that if you ever realized your own worth, you'd leave, and they'd lose their favorite target. She gripped the podium, her knuckles white. I would say that leaving is terrifying, and rebuilding is harder than staying, but you can do it. You're stronger than you know. And I would say that asking for help isn't weakness. Finding people who actually love you, who protect you without controlling you, who celebrate your strength instead of trying to diminish it, that's not betraying yourself. That's finally treating yourself the way you deserve to be treated. The young Omega was crying now, mascara streaking down her face. Nixera saw herself 3 years ago in that girl's expression, saw the desperate hope warring with learned helplessness, saw the moment when possibility began to crack through resignation. It gets better, Nixera said softly, directly to her, ignoring the cameras and the journalists and everyone else in the room. I promise you, it gets better. You just have to survive long enough to see it. The press conference ended to scattered applause and the immediate frenzy of journalists rushing to file their stories. Nixera stepped back from the podium, her legs suddenly unsteady, and Seojin was there instantly, his arm around her waist, supporting her weight as they walked backstage. You were perfect, he murmured against her hair. Absolutely perfect. I'm exhausted. I know. Let's get you back upstairs. But before they could leave, the young Omega from the final question appeared, escorted by one of Seojin's security team. She looked even younger up close, maybe 20 at most, with bruises poorly concealed under makeup and the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept soundly in months. I'm sorry, she said quickly, her words tumbling over themselves. I know you're busy, but I had to thank you. For saying what you said. For being honest about how hard it is. Everyone always makes it sound so easy, like you just leave and everything's fine, but it's not, and hearing you admit that made me feel less crazy. Nixera reached out, taking the girl's hand. What's your name? Mira. Mira-chan. Mira, are you safe right now? Today, this moment, are you safe? The girl hesitated, and that hesitation told Nixera everything she needed to know. I have a place to stay tonight. That's not what I asked. Myra's eyes filled with tears. No, I'm not safe. But I don't have anywhere else to go. My pack is his pack, and my family won't help because leaving would embarrass them, and I don't have money or connections or anything. Seojin pulled out his phone, typing quickly. You do now. I'm sending you information for 3 secure locations. Pick one. My people will have you there within the hour, and you'll stay as long as you need. No cost, no obligation, no questions asked beyond basic security clearance. Mira stared at him, disbelief and hope warring across her features. Why would you do that? You don't know me. Because my mate asked me to build systems that protect people like you. Because every Omega we help is one less person suffering the way Nixera suffered. Because it's the right thing to do. He handed her a card, embossed with the Azure clan sigil. Call that number. Tell them Silver Moon Protocol. They'll take care of the rest. Mira clutched the card like a lifeline, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Thank you. Both of you. I don't know how to repay this. You don't repay it, Nixera said gently. You survive. You heal. And when you're strong enough, you help the next person who needs it. That's how we break the cycle. They watched Mira leave, escorted by security, and Nixera felt something settle in her chest. The press conference had been about justice, about holding Dorian accountable, about reclaiming her narrative. But this moment, watching a terrified Omega accept help and walk toward safety, this was why everything else mattered. Back in the penthouse suite, Nixera finally let herself collapse onto the sofa, every ounce of energy spent. Seojin disappeared into the bedroom, returning with the pain medication Dr. Chen had prescribed. He handed her the pills and a glass of water, then sat beside her, pulling her carefully against his chest. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "In case I haven't said that enough. You say it constantly. Then I'll say it again. I'm proud of you. For coming back here, for facing them, for standing up there and telling the truth even when you knew half the people listening wanted to tear you apart. You're the strongest person I've ever met." Nixera tilted her head back to look at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the absolute conviction that she was worthy of every good thing life could offer. 3 years ago, she would have argued, would have insisted she was weak or broken or damaged beyond repair. Now she just accepted the compliment, let it sink in and take root alongside all the other truths she'd learned about herself. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too, my heart." Her phone buzzed again, another message from Aloan. Then another. And another. Desperation bleeding through in increasingly frantic texts. "Please, Nixera, just talk to me. I know I made mistakes, but we're family. Mom is devastated. You're tearing our family apart. If you don't help me, I'll lose everything." Nixera read them all, feeling nothing but a distant sort of pity. Aloan still didn't understand. She still thought this was about forgiveness, about family loyalty, about Nixera choosing to be cruel. She couldn't grasp that this was simply consequences, the natural result of choices made with full awareness of their potential cost. "She doesn't get it," Nixera murmured, showing Seojin the messages. "She still thinks I'm doing this to her instead of recognizing she did it to herself. People like that rarely do get it. They're so invested in seeing themselves as the hero of their own story that they can't process being the villain in someone else's. Should I block her? Only if you want to. But I suspect watching her unravel might be satisfying in its own way." Nixera smiled, dark and genuine. "You're a terrible influence. You knew that when you married me." They spent the rest of the evening in quiet companionship, watching news coverage of the press conference, reading reactions that ranged from supportive to viciously critical. Nixera found she didn't care as much as she'd expected about the critics, about the people determined to find fault in her story. She'd told the truth. What others chose to do with it was their responsibility, not hers. As night fell over Riverside, Nixera stood at the windows overlooking the city, Seojin's arms wrapped around her from behind. Tomorrow, she would visit Rosa one final time, would say goodbye to the only family member who'd ever truly loved her. Tomorrow, she would leave Riverside again, this time with her head high and her name cleared. But tonight, she let herself feel victorious. She'd walked back into hell and emerged not just unburned but stronger, carrying fire of her own. Dorian was in custody. Aloan was facing justice. And Nixera Valhanol was finally, undeniably free. "No regrets?" Seojin asked softly, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Not one." Somewhere below, the city continued its rhythm, unaware that one of its former victims had just reclaimed everything they'd tried to take from her. Nixera closed her eyes and let herself breathe, really breathe, for the first time since she'd stepped off the bus back into her past. The hardest part was over. Everything else was just moving forward. The hospital room looked different in morning light, somehow smaller and more fragile than Nixera remembered. Rosa lay propped against pillows that seemed too large for her diminishing frame, her breathing shallow and labored despite the oxygen line feeding into her nose. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, marking time in a language only the dying truly understood. Nixera stood in the doorway for a long moment, gathering herself. This would be goodbye. She'd known it when she'd boarded the bus to Riverside, had felt it in the urgency of Rosa's final request to see her. But knowing something intellectually and facing it emotionally were entirely different territories. Jean's hand settled on the small of her back, warm and grounding. "I'll wait outside if you'd prefer privacy." "No. Stay. She'd want to meet you properly." They entered together, and Rosa's eyes opened at the sound of their footsteps. For a moment, her gaze was unfocused, lost somewhere between consciousness and whatever dreams occupied her failing mind. Then recognition sharpened her features, and something like relief softened the lines pain had carved into her face. "Nixera," Rosa breathed, her voice barely audible over the machines. "You came back." "Of course I came back." Nixera moved to the bedside, taking her grandmother's hand with infinite gentleness. The skin felt papery, translucent enough to see the network of veins beneath. "I'll always come when you need me, Grandma." Rosa's eyes shifted to Jean, standing slightly behind Nixera with the same careful respect he'd shown throughout this entire ordeal. The old Omega studied him with the kind of penetrating awareness that suggested her mind remained sharp even as her body failed. "So this is your Alpha," Rosa said, managing a small smile. "The one who made the news very interesting yesterday. This is Jean Hanol, my husband. Come closer, young man. Let me see you properly." Jean moved to the other side of the bed, allowing Rosa to examine him without obstruction. Most alphas would have bristled at being scrutinized by an elderly Omega, would have demanded deference based purely on hierarchy. Jean simply stood still, patient and respectful, understanding that he was being evaluated by the one person whose opinion truly mattered to Nixera. "You look at her like she's the moon," Rosa observed, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "Like she's the only light worth following in the dark." "She is," Jean replied simply. "I spent 32 years waiting for something I didn't know I was missing. Then I met your granddaughter, and suddenly everything made sense." Rosa's smile widened fractionally. "Good answer. Now tell me the truth. Are you the type of alpha who'll try to control her? Dim her light because it makes you feel inadequate? Because if you are, I have just enough life left in me to haunt you properly." "Grandma," Nixera protested, somewhere between mortified and amused. "Hush, child. I'm dying. I'm allowed to be intrusive." Rosa's eyes never left Jean's face. "Well, I married Nixera because she survived what should have destroyed her and came out stronger. Because she's brilliant and kind and refuses to accept the limitations other people try to impose on her. The last thing I would ever do is try to diminish what makes her extraordinary." Jean's hand found Nixera's across the bed, their fingers interlocking. "She doesn't need me to be complete. She chooses to have me in her life, and I'm grateful for that choice every single day." Rosa was quiet for a moment, her breathing labored, but her expression satisfied. You'll do very well, I think." She turned her attention back to Nixera, her free hand reaching up to touch her granddaughter's face with trembling fingers. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you from them. Your mother, your sister, Dorian. I saw what was happening and I was too old, too powerless to stop it." "You did protect me," Nixera said fiercely, leaning into her grandmother's touch. "You told me to run. You gave me money when you barely had enough for yourself. You believed me when everyone else called me a liar. That's everything, Grandma. That's what saved my life. I should have done more. Should have stood up to them publicly, consequences be damned. You did what you could within the constraints of your situation. That's all any of us can do." Rosa's eyes grew wet, tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. "I'm glad you found him. I'm glad you found yourself. I worried so much after you left, wondered if you'd survive out there alone. But you didn't just survive. You thrived. I learned from you. You taught me that strength doesn't always look like power. Sometimes it looks like endurance. Sometimes it looks like choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. Sometimes it's just getting up one more time than you've been knocked down. My smart girl. Always were too clever for this small town." Rosa coughed, the sound wet and rattling. A nurse appeared in the doorway, checking monitors, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes sympathetic. I don't have much time left. Don't say that. It's the truth, sweetheart. And I've never been one for pretty lies. Rosa's grip tightened fractionally on Nixara's hand. I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't let them make you bitter. Your mother, your sister, all the people who hurt you. Don't give them the power to poison who you're becoming. Be angry, yes. Seek justice, absolutely. But don't let hatred consume the light you've built inside yourself. Nixara felt her throat constrict, tears she'd been holding back finally spilling free. I promise. And you, Rosa turned to Seojin again. Promise me you'll remind her of that when the anger gets too heavy. When she's tempted to destroy instead of heal. Be her balance. I will, Seojin said solemnly. You have my word. Rosa nodded, satisfied, and then her expression shifted to something lighter, almost mischievous despite her obvious pain. Now tell me about the wedding. I want details. Was it beautiful? Did you wear white? Did he cry? Nixara laughed through her tears, the sound breaking and genuine. It was small. Just us and a handful of witnesses. I wore blue Azure Clan colors. And yes, he cried. I did not cry, Seojin protested with mock indignation. You absolutely cried. I saw the tears. My eyes were watering from the incense. Completely different. Rosa chuckled, the sound dissolving into another cough. I wish I could have been there. Could have seen you happy, truly happy, instead of just hearing about it. You're seeing it. Right now. This is what happiness looks like, Grandma. Being with you, having Seojin beside me, knowing that I survived everything they tried to do to me. This is everything. They stayed for hours, talking when Rosa had the strength and sitting in comfortable silence when she didn't. Nixara told her grandmother about Seoul, about the restaurant where she'd met Seojin, about building a life from absolutely nothing and discovering she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Rosa listened with the focused intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail, storing them away for whatever came next. Lyris appeared in the doorway around noon, her expression a complicated mixture of grief and something harder to name. She hesitated when she saw Seojin, clearly having second thoughts about entering, but Rosa gestured her forward with visible impatience. Come in, Lyris. I'm dying, not dead yet. We might as well get this over with. Nixara's mother moved into the room with the careful steps of someone navigating a minefield. Mother, I just wanted to check on you. See if you needed anything. I need my family to stop tearing itself apart. But we both know that's not happening. Rosa's voice carried an edge Nixara had rarely heard, sharp enough to cut through Lyris's practiced concern. Where's Aloan? She's dealing with some legal issues. Nothing serious, I'm sure. Just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. Rosa's laugh was bitter. Is that what we're calling conspiracy and fraud now? A misunderstanding. Lyris's face flushed. You don't understand the full situation. Aloan made some mistakes, yes, but she's family. We should be supporting her, not throwing her to the wolves. She threw Nixara to the wolves 3 years ago, Rosa said flatly. Helped Dorian destroy her, took money to stay silent, and profited from her sister's suffering. Those aren't mistakes. Those are choices. You're being unfair. You've always favored Nixara. I favored the granddaughter who didn't betray her own blood for status and money. Rosa's breathing was labored now, the conversation taking its toll. I favored the one who had a spine. That's not fair, Lyris protested, but her voice lacked conviction. She looked at Nixara, something pleading in her expression. You could help her. You have connections now, power. You could make this all go away. Nixara felt Seojin tense beside her, felt his controlled anger on her behalf, but she didn't need his intervention. She'd found her own voice, and it no longer trembled when confronted by her mother's manipulations. No, she said simply. I won't. She's your sister. She stopped being my sister when she chose Dorian over me. When she helped him fabricate evidence. When she sold my research and used my name to scam other packs. She made those choices with full awareness of the consequences. Now she gets to face them. Lyris's expression hardened. You've changed. That man has made you cold. That man has helped me understand that protecting myself isn't the same as being cold. That setting boundaries doesn't make me cruel. That I don't owe loyalty to people who've only ever hurt me. Nyxera stood, positioning herself between her mother and Rosa's bed. If you came here hoping I'd intercede on Aloan's behalf, you've wasted your time. If you came to see Grandma, then sit down and be present. Otherwise, leave. You can't speak to me like that. I'm your mother. You were my mother, Rosa corrected, her voice weak but clear. Then you took money to look the other way while Nyxera was abused. That's when you stopped being her mother and became just another person who failed her. Lyris's face crumpled, genuine grief breaking through the carefully maintained facade. I thought I was doing what was best. Dorian said he could help her, that he just needed time and space. I thought keeping out of it would make things easier. You thought $50,000 would make ignoring your daughter's suffering easier, Nyxera said quietly. Don't rewrite history now that you're facing consequences. You knew what was happening. You chose to pretend you didn't. I'm sorry, Lyris whispered, tears streaming down her face. I know that's not enough, but I am sorry. Sorry isn't a magic word that erases what you did. It's a starting point for changed behavior, for making amends, for doing better. Have you done any of those things? Lyris was silent, which was answer enough. I didn't think so. Nyxera turned back to Rosa, dismissing her mother without another word. It should have felt cruel, but instead it felt like finally putting down a weight she'd been carrying too long. Grandma, do you want her here? No, Rosa said softly. I'm tired, and I'd rather spend what time I have left with people who actually love me. Lyris left without argument, her shoulders shaking with sobs that felt performative even in their genuine grief. The door closed behind her, and the room felt lighter somehow, as if toxic air had finally been ventilated. I'm sorry you had to do that, Rosa murmured. I know it wasn't easy. It was easier than I expected, Nyxera admitted. A year ago, I would have apologized, would have tried to make her feel better, would have taken responsibility for her hurt feelings. Now I just feel relieved that I said what needed to be said. That's growth, sweetheart. That's healing. They settled back into comfortable silence, Rosa dozing intermittently while Nyxera held her hand and Seojin worked quietly on his laptop, handling clan business that couldn't wait but doing it with one eye always on Nyxera in case she needed him. Late afternoon brought another visitor, one that made Nyxera's spine stiffen with immediate tension. Aloan appeared in the doorway wearing the carefully constructed mask of contrition that Nyxera recognized from childhood, the expression she'd always used when their parents caught her doing something wrong. I know you don't want to see me, Aloan started, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. But I had to try. We're family, Nyxera. We're sisters. We share blood, Nyxera corrected coldly. That doesn't make us family. Please, just hear me out. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Seojin stood, his movements fluid and predatory. She's asking you to leave. I suggest you listen. This is between sisters. It's not your business. Everything concerning my mate is my business. His voice dropped to something dangerous, the Alpha King emerging from beneath the gentle husband. You have 10 seconds to leave voluntarily. After that, my people remove you forcibly. Your choice. Aloan's eyes flashed with familiar resentment, that old jealousy that had always simmered beneath their relationship. Of course you found yourself a powerful alpha. That's always been your talent, hasn't it? Playing the victim until someone strong feels sorry for you. That's enough, Rosa said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her obvious exhaustion. Aloan Vale, you will leave this room immediately, or I will use my last breaths to curse you so thoroughly that every pack in the territory will hear about it. Grandma, you don't understand what she's done to me. She's destroyed my reputation, gotten me arrested, turned everyone against me. All because she's jealous that Dorian chose me. Dorian didn't choose you, Nixera said, standing to face her sister directly. He used you. Just like he used me. Just like he used everyone who was stupid enough to think his attention meant something. The difference is that I got out, and you convinced yourself that being his accomplice made you special. I loved him. You loved what he represented. Status. Power. The ability to feel superior to me. That's not love. That's insecurity with a prettier name. Eloan's composure finally cracked completely, the mask of vulnerability sliding off to reveal the ugly reality beneath. You ruined everything. We had a plan. Dorian and I were going to be together officially once enough time had passed. We were going to lead the pack, have a real future. Then you showed up married to him. She jerked her chin towards Seojin, and suddenly everyone cares what happened 3 years ago. People should have cared 3 years ago, Nixera said. But you made sure they didn't. You helped Dorian fabricate evidence, convinced people I was lying, took money to keep quiet about what you knew. Those aren't the actions of someone who loves their sister. You were always weak. Always the victim. I did what I had to do to survive in this pack. No. You did what you wanted to do because hurting me made you feel powerful. Don't pretend this was strategy. It was cruelty, pure and simple. Rosa's voice cut through the tension. Eloan, I want you to listen very carefully because these will be the last words I ever speak to you. You had a choice. Every step of the way, you had a choice. You could have protected your sister. You could have told the truth. You could have been the kind of person worth knowing. But you chose cruelty. You chose betrayal. You chose to destroy someone who loved you because it was easier than building yourself into someone worthwhile. The old Omega's breathing was labored, each word clearly costing her. I'm ashamed to call you my granddaughter. I'm ashamed that my blood runs in your veins. And I hope, for your sake, that someday you understand the magnitude of what you've lost by choosing to be this person. Eloan stood frozen, her face cycling through shock, hurt, and finally settling on rage. Fine. If that's how you all want it, fine. I don't need any of you. I'll get through this on my own, and when I do, don't come crawling back asking for forgiveness. She stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to make the machines rattle. In the silence that followed, Rosa closed her eyes, exhausted by the confrontation. I'm sorry, Nixera whispered. I'm sorry that had to be your last conversation with her. Don't be. She needed to hear it. And I needed to say it before I run out of time. Rosa's hand squeezed Nixera's weakly. Promise me you won't let her back in. Not until she's done real work to change, if she ever does. I promise. Good girl. The afternoon faded into evening, the light outside the window shifting from gold to amber to the deep purple of approaching night. Rosa drifted in and out of consciousness, each return seeming to cost her more energy than the last. Nixera stayed beside her, telling stories when her grandmother was awake and simply being present when she slept. Seojin ordered food they barely touched, made quiet phone calls to handle business that couldn't wait, and provided the kind of steady support that required nothing from Nixera except the willingness to accept it. As night fully settled over Riverside, Rosa woke one final time. Her eyes were clear, lucid, carrying the kind of awareness that suggested she knew exactly what was coming. It's time, she said softly. I can feel it. Don't say that. The doctors said you might have a few more days. Doctors are often wrong about these things. I know my own body. Rosa smiled, peaceful and ready. I'm not afraid, sweetheart. I'm tired and I'm ready to rest. The only thing keeping me here was making sure you were okay. Now I've seen you happy, strong, loved. That's all I needed. I'm not ready to lose you. You won't lose me. I'll be in every lesson I taught you, every moment of strength you find inside yourself, every time you choose kindness over cruelty. That's what love is. It doesn't end just because a body stops working. Nixera laid her head on the bed beside her grandmother's hand, tears soaking into the hospital linens. I love you, Grandma. Thank you for being the only person who ever really saw me. I love you too, my brilliant girl. More than you'll ever know. Rosa's hand moved to stroke Nixura's hair, the gesture weak but infinitely tender. Take care of her, Seojin. She's stronger than anyone I've ever met, but even the strong need someone to lean on. Always, Seojin promised, his own voice rough with emotion. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she knows how extraordinary she is. Good. That's all I can ask for. Rosa closed her eyes then, her breathing slowing, becoming shallower. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, but something had changed in the quality of the sound, a subtle shift that spoke of endings rather than continuings. Nixura held her grandmother's hand and watched the woman who'd saved her life slip peacefully away. There was no dramatic final moment, no last desperate grasp at life. Just a quiet transition from being to not being, as natural as breathing despite the grief it left in its wake. The machines flatlined with a sound that would echo in Nixura's memory forever. Nurses appeared, respectful and efficient, confirming what everyone in the room already knew. Rosa was gone. Seojin pulled Nixura against him as she sobbed, great heaving cries that came from somewhere deep and primal. He didn't try to quiet her or tell her it would be okay. He just held her, providing the kind of solid presence that let her fall apart without fear of shattering completely. They stayed until Nixura had no tears left, until her body was empty and exhausted and strangely lighter. Then Seojin helped her navigate the paperwork and arrangements, handling logistics so she could simply exist in her grief without having to perform functionality. The funeral was scheduled for 2 days later, giving Nixura time to make arrangements and allowing distant relatives time to travel. She chose a simple service at the cemetery where Rosa's husband was buried, nothing elaborate or performative. Just truth and love and goodbye. Standing in the hotel suite that night, Nixura felt hollowed out, scraped clean of everything except the awareness that the last person who'd loved her unconditionally was gone. Seojin found her at the window, staring out at Riverside's lights without really seeing them. Tell me something, she said quietly. Tell me something true about yourself. Something you've never told anyone else. He considered for a moment, understanding that she needed distraction, needed to focus on something other than the gaping absence Rosa had left behind. I was engaged once. Before I met you. To an Omega my family had chosen, someone who checked all the appropriate boxes for status and connections. What happened? I realized she didn't love me. She loved what I represented. The power, the status, the security. And I couldn't live with someone who saw me as a position rather than a person. So I called it off 3 weeks before the wedding, caused a massive scandal, and spent the next 5 years refusing every match my family suggested. Were you lonely? Constantly. But I'd rather be lonely alone than lonely with someone who didn't actually see me. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Then I met you, and I understood why nothing else had ever felt right. Because I was waiting for someone who looked at me and saw Seojin, not the Alpha King. Someone who challenged me and made me want to be better than I thought I could be. I was broken when you met me. You were healing. There's a difference. His thumb brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling. And you taught me that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about putting yourself back together and choosing to keep living despite everything that tried to destroy you. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped around each other while Riverside slept beneath them. Nixura felt Rosa's absence like a physical wound, but alongside the pain was something else. Gratitude. Relief. The knowledge that her grandmother had died knowing she was loved, knowing the girl she'd protected had survived and thrived. She was proud of you, Seojin said softly. In case there was any doubt. I know. She told me. Nixura pressed closer, needing his warmth, his solid reality. Thank you for being here. For all of this. I know dealing with my family drama wasn't part of the marriage contract. Actually, loving you through everything life throws at us was exactly what I promised when we bonded. This is just me keeping my word. Sleep came eventually, fitful and broken by dreams of snow and hospital rooms and goodbyes that felt both final and insufficient. But when Nixer awoke in the early hours, Seojin was there, alert and watching, ready to pull her back from nightmares or simply hold her through the darkness. The next 2 days passed in a blur of arrangements and decisions. Nixera chose Rosa's favorite flowers for the service, selected readings that honored her grandmother's fierce independence, and wrote a eulogy that captured 3 decades of love in impossibly inadequate words. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and cold, the kind of weather that matched grief so perfectly it felt almost scripted. Nixera dressed in black, accepting Seojin's help when her hands shook too much to manage buttons. His people had prepared everything, coordinating with the funeral home and ensuring security was discreet but present. The cemetery was old, established when Riverside was barely a village, filled with graves that marked generations of pack history. Rosa's plot was beside her husband's, a spot she'd chosen decades ago when death was still abstract rather than imminent. Nixera stood at the graveside watching mourners arrive, recognizing faces from her childhood, people who'd known Rosa and respected her even when they'd failed to protect her granddaughter. Conspicuously absent were Lyris and Aloan, both choosing to stay away rather than face the judgment their presence would invite. The service was brief, respectful, focused more on celebration than mourning. Nixera spoke last, her voice steady despite the grief threatening to crack her composure. My grandmother taught me that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It's about showing up. It's about telling the truth even when lies would be easier. It's about believing someone when the whole world calls them a liar. She showed up for me when no one else would, believed me when everyone else turned away, and gave me the tools I needed to survive. I'm standing here today because she loved me enough to let me go, to tell me to run and save myself even though it meant losing me. That's the kind of love that changes lives. That's the legacy she left behind. She placed a single white rose on the casket, her fingers lingering on the polished wood. Thank you, Grandma, for everything. I promise I'll make you proud. As the service concluded and mourners began to disperse, an elderly Omega approached Nixera, her face weathered and kind. You don't remember me, but I knew Rosa for 50 years. We worked together at the Pack School before we both retired. I'm sorry, I don't remember. No reason you should. You were very young. The woman smiled sadly. I just wanted you to know that Rosa talked about you constantly. How proud she was, how worried, how relieved when she finally heard you were safe and happy. You were her whole world. She was mine too. The only person who ever made me feel like I mattered. She knew that. And she died knowing you'd be all right. That's all any parent or grandparent can hope for. The woman moved away, and others came forward with similar stories, painting a picture of Rosa that Nixera recognized but hadn't fully understood. Her grandmother hadn't just loved her. She'd been an advocate, a protector, a voice speaking truth to anyone who would listen even when it cost her socially. Seojin appeared at her elbow as the crowd thinned, offering silent support without overwhelming her need to process alone. Together they walked through the cemetery, reading names and dates, marking the passage of lives that had mattered to someone somewhere. I want to do something, Nixera said suddenly, stopping beside a newer section of graves. Something that matters. Something that would make Rosa proud. What are you thinking? A foundation. Resources for Omegas trying to leave abusive situations. Safe houses, legal aid, job training, therapy. Everything I needed when I ran and couldn't find. I want to build systems that catch people before they fall through cracks. Seojin was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. We can do that. The Azure clans have resources, and I have connections throughout the territory. We could start small, maybe here in Riverside, then expand as funding allows. I want to call it the Rosa Vale Foundation. Make sure people remember her name, remember what she stood for. Then that's what we'll do. He pulled her close, his chin resting on top of her head. We'll build something that helps people the way you needed help. Something that proves her faith in you is justified." They stood like that while the sun broke through clouds, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Nixera felt something shift inside her, grief making space for purpose, loss transforming into legacy. Rosa was gone, but the work she'd started by saving one frightened Omega could continue, could expand, could touch lives Rosa would never meet, but would have loved just as fiercely. "I'm ready to leave," Nixera said finally. "Ready to go home. Soul, wherever you are. That's home now." They walked back to the car hand in hand, leaving Rosa to rest beside her husband in the earth that had held so many before her. Nixera looked back once, memorizing the scene, then faced forward and didn't look back again. Riverside was finished. This chapter was closed. Everything else was just moving forward into whatever came next. 6 months had passed since Riverside, since Rosa's funeral, since Nixera had walked away from her past and into the future she was building one deliberate choice at a time. Souls sprawled beneath the penthouse windows, the city lights reflecting off the Han River like scattered diamonds, beautiful and impersonal in the way only cities could be. Nixera stood at those windows now, coffee cooling in her hands, watching dawn break over a skyline that had become more familiar than Riverside ever was. Behind her, papers rustled as Seojin reviewed contracts at the dining table, his reading glasses perched on his nose in a way that made him look more like a professor than the most feared alpha in the Eastern Territories. They'd fallen into this routine over the past months, these quiet mornings before the world demanded their attention, stolen moments of domesticity between the chaos of running a criminal empire and building a foundation from scratch. The property acquisition went through, Seojin said without looking up from his documents. "The building on Maple Street is officially ours. 3 floors, 22 rooms, parking in the back. Perfect for what you have planned." Nixera turned from the window, feeling something warm settle in her chest. The building on Maple Street was in Riverside, 2 blocks from where she'd grown up, close enough to the packed territory to be accessible, but far enough to feel safe. It would become the first Rosa Vale Foundation shelter, the physical manifestation of everything she'd promised herself while watching her grandmother die. "When can we start renovations?" "Contractors are ready to begin next week. I've had my people vet everyone thoroughly. No pack connections, no ties to anyone who might have loyalty to the Cades or the Frostvale Elders. Everyone working on this building will be there because they believe in what we're doing, not because they owe someone a favor." "You've thought of everything." "I've tried to." He finally looked up, removing his glasses and setting them aside. "This matters to you, which means it matters to me. I want it done right." Nixera crossed the room, settling into his lap with the ease of practice, careful of the ribs that had finally stopped aching a month ago. His arms came around her automatically, holding her close while she rested her head against his shoulder. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "about expanding sooner than we planned. Not just Riverside. There are other territories, other packs where Omegas are trapped the same way I was. If we have the resources, why wait? Because building sustainable systems takes time. Rush it, and we risk creating something that looks impressive but doesn't actually function when people need it most." His hand traced slow patterns on her back, soothing and grounding. "But if you want to accelerate the timeline, we can discuss it. Bring me a proposal, show me how we'd staff and fund multiple locations simultaneously, and I'll make it happen. Just like that. Just like that. This is your vision, Nixera. I'm just providing the infrastructure." She kissed him then, slow and deep, tasting coffee and the mint toothpaste he'd used an hour ago. When she pulled back, his eyes had darkened in the way they did when business shifted to pleasure, but his phone buzzed before either of them could act on the heat building between them. "I need to take this," he said reluctantly, checking the screen. "It's Detective Han about the Cade case." Nixera slid off his lap, giving him privacy for the conversation while she poured fresh coffee and checked her own messages. 6 months of legal proceedings had turned Dorian's trial into a media spectacle, every detail of his abuse and fraud dissected by journalists and commentators looking for the most sensational angle. Nixera had stopped reading the coverage after the first month, too exhausted by the constant requests for interviews and the armchair psychologists analyzing her decisions. "Sentencing is scheduled for next week," Seojin said, ending the call. "Han says the prosecution is confident they'll get the full 15 years. No possibility of early parole, given the severity and the public attention." And Aloan? 5 years, suspended to 3 with good behavior. She took the plea deal, agreed to testify against Dorian and provide evidence of the larger conspiracy. His expression was neutral, carefully controlled. "She's also been ordered to pay restitution. $75,000 to you for the identity theft and fraud, plus court costs." Nixera felt nothing at the news, no satisfaction or vindication, just a distant sort of acknowledgement that justice had been served in the limited way systems allowed. "I don't want her money." "Then donate it to the foundation. Fund scholarships or therapy sessions or whatever feels right. But don't refuse it out of some misplaced sense that accepting makes you petty. She owes you this. Let her pay." He was right, as he usually was about these things. Nixera nodded, filing the information away to process later when she had more emotional bandwidth. "What about my mother?" "No criminal charges. She cooperated with investigators, returned the money Dorian had paid her, and by all accounts has been trying to rebuild her life quietly." Seojin's voice carried no judgment, just facts delivered neutrally. "She's asked to meet with you. Multiple times. I've been declining on your behalf, but if you want to see her, I won't stop you. I don't know what I want where she's concerned." Nixera stared into her coffee like it might hold answers. "Part of me wants to hear her out, wants to believe she's genuinely sorry. But another part remembers that she took money to ignore my suffering, and sorry doesn't undo that." "Then don't decide right now. Give yourself permission to not know, to wait until you're ready or until you're certain you'll never be ready. There's no deadline on forgiveness." Her phone buzzed, pulling her from thoughts of Lyris and what reconciliation might look like if it were even possible. The notification was from the Foundation's temporary website, the basic page they'd set up to gauge interest and collect contact information from people who wanted to help or needed help. "We got another inquiry," Nixera said, scanning the message. 22-year-old Omega in Busan says her mate has been violent for 3 years and she's afraid to leave because his pack controls the local police. Forward it to the response team. They'll handle initial intake and threat assessment. The response team was 6 people Seojin had personally hired and trained, experts in crisis intervention and domestic violence who understood both human and wolf pack dynamics. They worked in shifts, ensuring someone was always available to respond to inquiries within an hour. In the 6 weeks since the website had gone live, they'd fielded 43 requests for help and successfully relocated 11 Omegas to safe housing. Nixera sent the message along, then pulled up the Foundation's project management software. The interface showed timelines and budgets and staffing needs, all the boring logistics that transformed good intentions into functional reality. She'd spent months learning the business side of nonprofit work, taking online courses in organizational management and fundraising, while Seojin connected her with people who'd built similar organizations and could offer guidance. "The gala is in 2 weeks," she said, reviewing the event checklist. "We're at 70% capacity for tickets, with another 50 people on the waiting list." The gala was Seojin's idea, a fundraising event that would introduce the Rosa Vale Foundation to Seoul's elite and establish Nixera as a serious philanthropist rather than just the Alpha King's wife. She'd resisted initially, uncomfortable with the performative aspects of high society charity, but he'd convinced her that accessing serious money meant playing the games serious money required. "I've confirmed the venue and the catering. Security is handled. You just need to finalize your speech." Seojin stood, stretching with the unconscious grace of someone who'd trained in combat since childhood. And we should probably discuss what you're wearing. The designers have been sending samples. I hate this part. The dressing up, the performing, pretending I care about impressing people who wouldn't have looked at me twice before I married you. Then don't impress them. Be yourself. Tell Rosa's story, explain what you're building, and let them see the person who survived what should have destroyed her. That's more impressive than any performance. He was right again, frustratingly right in the way that made her want to kiss him and argue with him simultaneously. She pulled up the speech draft she'd been working on, reading through words that felt simultaneously too personal and not personal enough. Listen to this part and tell me if it's too much, she said, scrolling to the second page. I was taught that being an Omega meant accepting whatever treatment alphas decided I deserved. That love was supposed to hurt, that silence was survival, that asking for help was weakness. I believed those lies for so long that I almost died from them. The Rosa Vale Foundation exists to tell a different truth, to show Omegas trapped in situations like mine that survival is possible, that help is available, that they deserve better than what they've been told to accept. Seojin listened with the focused attention he gave everything she created, his expression thoughtful. It's perfect. Don't change a word. You always say that. Because you always underestimate how powerful your truth is. He crossed to where she sat, tilting her chin up to meet his eyes. These people are coming to feel good about themselves, to write checks that buy them social capital and tax deductions. You're going to remind them that behind those checks are actual lives, actual people who need more than their spare change. That's not too much. That's exactly enough. The day of the gala arrived with a kind of perfect weather that felt arranged by divine intervention, clear skies and temperatures that encouraged evening gowns without requiring heavy coats. Nixera spent the afternoon being transformed by a team of stylists who descended on the penthouse like a particularly glamorous invasion force, turning her into a version of herself that looked confident and polished and entirely unlike the girl who'd stepped off a bus in Riverside with $47 and a single bag. The dress was midnight blue, azure clan colors, cut to flatter without revealing too much, elegant without being ostentatious. Her hair was styled in loose waves, her makeup subtle, but expertly applied to enhance rather than mask. The only jewelry she wore was her wedding ring and the pendant Seojin had given her when they bonded, a silver moon with a star nestled in its curve. You look like a Luna, Seojin said when she finally emerged from the bedroom, his expression somewhere between reverent and predatory. I look like I'm playing dress-up. You look like exactly who you are. Powerful, beautiful, and completely unaware of how extraordinary you've become. He offered his arm, formal and courtly. Ready to charm rich people into giving us their money? As ready as I'll ever be. The gala was held at one of Seoul's most exclusive hotels, the ballroom decorated in silver and white with the foundation's logo displayed prominently on screens throughout the space. Guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored suits, the kind of people whose influence shaped territories and whose donations could fund entire organizations. Nixera recognized several faces from news coverage, pack leaders, and business magnates and politicians who'd built empires through combinations of legitimate business and carefully managed criminal enterprises. Seojin moved through the crowd with practiced ease, introducing Nixera to people whose names she'd been studying for weeks, facilitating conversations that might lead to partnerships or funding. She felt out of place initially, too aware of her origins, of the fact that most of these people came from generational wealth while she'd been scrubbing floors in Seoul hostels 6 years ago. But then a woman approached, an older Omega wearing diamonds that probably cost more than Nixera's childhood home, and said something that shifted the entire evening. I saw your press conference 6 months ago. The one after the mall incident. The woman's voice was quiet, meant only for Nixera. I was in a similar situation 20 years ago. Different pack, different circumstances, but the same fundamental abuse. I didn't have anywhere to go, anyone to help. I stayed for 8 more years before I finally found the courage to leave. If something like your foundation had existed then, I might have saved myself a decade of suffering. Nixera felt her throat tighten. I'm sorry you went through that. Don't be sorry. Just succeed. Build what you're trying to build, help the people who need it, and make sure no one else has to waste years of their life the way I did. The woman pulled out a checkbook, writing an amount that made Nixera's eyes widen. This is for your first year of operations. Call me if you need more. Similar conversations happened throughout the evening, Omegas and Alphas both approaching with stories of their own or stories of people they'd known, people they'd failed to help or wished they could have saved. By the time Nixera stepped up to the podium to give her speech, she understood that this wasn't about performing for the wealthy. It was about speaking truth to people who'd lived adjacent to similar truths, who understood that abuse didn't discriminate based on tax brackets. She delivered her speech without notes, speaking from the heart about Rosa, about survival, about the systems that failed vulnerable people and the new systems they were building to catch those who fell through existing cracks. Her voice remained steady even when emotion threatened to crack her composure, even when she saw people in the audience crying openly at her descriptions of what escaping abuse actually looked like. The Rosa Vale Foundation isn't charity, she concluded, gripping the podium. It's investment. Investment in lives that society has decided aren't worth protecting, in people who've been told they're worthless so many times they've started to believe it. We're building proof that survival is possible, that help exists, that no one has to endure what I endured just because they were born Omega or happened to love the wrong person. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing this matters. And thank you for helping us turn hope into infrastructure. The applause was thunderous, genuine rather than polite, and as Nixera stepped away from the podium, she was immediately surrounded by people wanting to talk, to contribute, to be part of what she was building. Seojin appeared at her elbow, running interference when the crowd became overwhelming, but his expression was proud, almost smug in his certainty that she'd succeed. By the end of the evening, they'd raised enough money to fund 3 shelters for 2 years, with pledges for ongoing support that would ensure sustainability beyond the initial launch. Nixera's feet ached from hours in heels, her face hurt from smiling, and she was more exhausted than she'd been since leaving Riverside. But underneath the fatigue was something else, something that felt like purpose crystallizing into reality. You did it, Seojin said as they finally escaped to the car, his hand finding hers in the darkness. You stood in front of Seoul's elite and made them care about something beyond themselves. That's not easy. I just told the truth. You told your truth in a way that made it universal. That's art, Nixera. That's power. The construction on the Riverside shelter finished 3 weeks later. The building transformed from abandoned office space into something warm and functional. Nixera insisted on being there for the final walkthrough, examining every room, every security measure, every detail that would determine whether this place felt safe or institutional. The first floor held common spaces, a kitchen designed for communal cooking, offices for counselors and legal advocates, and a play area for children. The second and third floors were divided into private rooms, each one equipped with the basics someone fleeing abuse would need, beds and dressers and small bathrooms that locked from the inside. The basement had been converted into a secure storage area for personal belongings and a panic room in case of emergency. It's perfect, Nixera said, standing in what would become the main living area. It feels like a home, not a shelter. That was the goal. The shelter's director, a woman named Sarah Chin who'd spent 15 years working in crisis intervention, gestured around the space. We want people to feel safe here, not just physically but emotionally. This isn't a way station. It's a place where healing can begin. They'd hired 10 full-time staff members for the Riverside location, all of them trained in trauma-informed care, all of them background-checked so thoroughly that Seojin's security team had joked about joining the FBI. The shelter would officially open in 2 weeks, the date chosen to coincide with what would have been Rosa's 88th birthday. Nixera walked through the building one more time, imagining the people who would sleep in these rooms, cook in this kitchen, find safety within these walls. She thought about the girl she'd been 6 years ago, desperate and terrified and convinced she was worthless. If this place had existed then, how much suffering might she have avoided? How many years could she have saved? "Thank you," she said to Sarah, to the staff members giving tours, to Seojin who'd made all of this possible. "Thank you for believing in this." The official opening drew media attention, journalists and cameras documenting the ribbon-cutting ceremony, while Nixera spoke about Rosa's legacy and the Foundation's mission. The mayor of Riverside attended, offering platitudes about community support that rang hollow given how thoroughly that community had failed Nixera when she'd needed them. She smiled and accepted his proclamation declaring it Rosa Vale Day, filing away her cynicism for private conversations later. What mattered more than the mayor's performance was the line of people waiting to speak with intake counselors, Omegas who'd heard about the shelter and traveled from across the territory, hoping for help. Nixera spent hours talking with them, hearing stories that mirrored her own in ways that were both heartbreaking and validating. She wasn't alone in what she'd survived. She'd never been alone, just isolated by systems designed to keep victims silent. One woman, barely 20, approached Nixera with a black eye poorly concealed under makeup and a desperation that was painfully familiar. "Is it true you're not going to ask a lot of questions? That you'll just help? We need some basic information for safety purposes," Nixera explained gently. "But we're not here to judge or interrogate. If you need help, we'll help. It's that simple. My mate says no one will believe me. That his family is too powerful, that I'm nothing without him. He's wrong. You're everything without him. You're a person who deserves safety and respect and the chance to build a life that doesn't hurt. We can help you do that if you'll let us." The woman started crying, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and wounded. Nixera held her, this stranger whose story she knew intimately, and felt Rosa's presence like a benediction. This was the work. This was what mattered. Not the galas or the media coverage, but these quiet moments when someone desperate found hope where they'd expected only more rejection. By the end of the opening day, they'd processed intake for 7 people, with another dozen scheduled for follow-up appointments. The shelter's first residents moved in that evening, carrying garbage bags full of belongings and children who'd grown up thinking violence was normal. Nixera stayed until everyone was settled, making sure each person knew where things were, how to contact staff in emergencies, what resources were available. "You should go home," Sarah said gently after midnight, finding Nixera in the kitchen making tea for a resident who couldn't sleep. "You've been here for 16 hours. The staff has this handled." "I know. I just wanted to make sure everyone felt welcome." "They do. You've made sure of that. Now go home to your mate before he sends his entire security team to extract you." Nixera laughed, recognizing the truth in that prediction. She said goodnight to the few residents still awake, promised she'd be back soon, and stepped out into the riverside night. Seojin was waiting in the car, having spent his own day handling clan business that couldn't wait, and his expression softened when he saw her exhaustion. "How did it go?" 7 intakes, all of them placed in secure housing. 3 children under 10 years old. 1 woman who'd been planning to kill herself before she saw the news about the shelter opening. Nixera climbed into the car, letting herself sink into the leather seats. "It went exactly how I hoped it would. I'm proud of you. You're always proud of me. Because you're always doing things worth being proud of." He pulled her against him, his warmth seeping through her exhaustion. "Ready to go home?" "Which home?" "Whichever one feels right. Seoul or here. We own property in both places now." Nixera thought about it, weighing her attachment to Seoul against the pull of staying close to the work she'd started. "Here, I think. At least for a few more days. I want to be accessible if anyone needs me." They'd purchased a house on the outskirts of Riverside 3 months ago, a quiet property with enough land to provide privacy and security systems that would make breaking in roughly as difficult as infiltrating a military base. Seojin had insisted on both the purchase and the security, refusing to let Nixura be in Riverside without protection now that she'd made enemies of people who'd once wielded unchallenged power. The house was dark when they arrived, the kind of peaceful darkness that spoke of safety rather than threat. Inside, they moved through evening routines with practiced ease, Nixura showering off the day while Seojin handled final business calls to Seoul. When she emerged, he was waiting in the bedroom, already changed into sleep clothes, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed something on his tablet. "Come here," he said without looking up, and she did, crawling into bed beside him and letting him pull her close. "I have something to show you." He pulled up an email, turning the tablet so she could read. It was from the young Omega who'd asked the final question at the press conference 6 months ago, Mira-chan, the girl they'd helped relocate the same day. "Dear Mrs. Hanol, I wanted to update you on how things are going. I've been in the safe house for 6 months now, and I finally feel like I can breathe. I'm taking classes at the community college, studying to be a counselor so I can help other people the way you helped me. My therapist says I'm making good progress, that I'm healing. I never thought healing was possible for someone like me, someone so broken. But you were right. It gets better. Thank you for showing me that survival isn't just possible but worth fighting for. I hope to meet you again someday and tell you in person how much you changed my life." Nixura felt tears slip free, her throat too tight for words. This was why everything else mattered, why the press conferences and the legal battles and the painful confrontations with her past had been necessary. Because somewhere out there, people who'd felt as hopeless as she once had were finding reasons to keep living. "She's not the only one," Seojin said quietly. "The response team has been compiling testimonials. 43 people placed in safe housing over 6 months, and 38 of them are still engaged with our support services. That's an 88% retention rate. Most shelters consider 50% success. We're doing it. We're actually doing it. You're doing it. I'm just making sure you have what you need." He set the tablet aside, pulling her fully into his arms. "I love you. In case I haven't said it enough today. You say it constantly. Then I'll say it again. I love you. I love your strength, your compassion, your refusal to let trauma define you. I love watching you build something meaningful from the worst moments of your life. You're extraordinary, Nixura. I hope you're finally starting to believe that." She kissed him instead of answering, pouring everything she felt into the contact, gratitude and love, and the bone-deep certainty that she'd somehow found exactly what she needed when she'd stopped looking for it. They made love slowly, carefully, each touch a reaffirmation of the bond they'd built over 3 years of choosing each other every single day. Afterward, wrapped in sheets and each other, Nixura felt something settle inside her. A sense of completion, of having traveled through hell and emerged somewhere worth being. She thought about Dorian in prison, about Eloan's conviction, about Lyris trying to rebuild a life without her daughter's forgiveness. She thought about Rosa buried beside her husband, her legacy living on in the foundation that bore her name. But mostly she thought about tomorrow, about the 7 people sleeping in the Riverside shelter who would wake up safe for the first time in years. About Mira studying to become a counselor. About the next person who would call the hotline or fill out the website form or show up desperate and scared and hoping for help. "I'm home," she whispered against Seojin's chest. "Finally, actually home." "You are," he agreed, his arms tightening. "You always have been. You just needed time to believe it." Sleep came easily for the first time since returning to Riverside, dreamless and deep, the kind of rest that came from knowing she'd done something meaningful with her pain. When morning arrived, Nixura woke to sunlight streaming through curtains and the sound of Seojin already awake, moving quietly around the room trying not to disturb her. "What time is it?" she mumbled, still half asleep. Early. 6:30. Go back to sleep if you want. Why are you up? Meeting with the construction team about the second shelter location. They found a property in Gwangju that might work, but I wanted to inspect it personally before we make an offer. He sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed in what she privately called his business alpha outfit, all sharp lines and expensive fabric. I'll be back by noon. I should come with you. You should rest. You've been running yourself ragged for months. Take a morning off, sleep in, eat breakfast that isn't protein bars and coffee. He leaned down, kissing her forehead. I'll send pictures and we can discuss it tonight. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist on being involved in every decision, but exhaustion won out. Okay, but call me if anything seems off. Always. He left, and Nixura drifted back to sleep, waking again 2 hours later feeling more rested than she had in weeks. She made breakfast properly, actually cooking instead of grabbing whatever was fastest, and ate on the back porch while reading updates from the Seoul office about donor engagement and media coverage. Her phone rang just as she finished eating, an unknown number with a Riverside area code. She almost ignored it, assuming it was a journalist looking for a quote, but something made her answer. Mrs. Hanol? A woman's voice, official and careful. This is Judge Patricia Morrison from Riverside Superior Court. I'm calling about a matter involving your sister, Aloan Vale. Nixura felt her stomach tighten. What about her? Ms. Vale has petitioned the court for a reduction in her sentence based on medical circumstances. She's claiming severe depression and suicidal ideation, requesting transfer to a psychiatric facility rather than completing her sentence in standard detention. The prosecution wants your input before we make a determination. My input. You're the primary victim in her case. Your opinion carries weight. If you believe she's genuinely struggling, we can consider psychiatric intervention. If you believe this is manipulation, we'll take that into account as well. Nixura closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. This was the test Rosa had warned her about, the moment when she'd have to choose between justice and mercy, between protecting herself and extending grace to someone who'd never shown her the same consideration. Can I have time to think about it? The hearing is in 3 days. We need your statement by tomorrow morning at the latest. I'll have it to you by tonight. She ended the call and sat in the morning sunlight, feeling the complexity of family and forgiveness and consequences swirl through her mind like competing currents. Part of her wanted to insist Aloan serve every single day of her sentence, wanted to protect future victims from someone who'd proven herself willing to harm others for personal gain. But another part, the part that Rosa had nurtured, wondered if mercy might accomplish what punishment couldn't. When Seo-jin returned that afternoon, Nixura explained the situation, laying out the competing considerations without editorializing. He listened with the focused attention he always gave her dilemmas, asking clarifying questions but offering no judgment. What do you want to do? He asked finally. I don't know. I keep thinking about what Rosa said, about not letting hatred consume me. But I also think about the next person Aloan might hurt if she doesn't face real consequences. Those aren't mutually exclusive concerns. You can believe in mercy and still maintain boundaries. You can hope she gets help without trusting her not to hurt people. He took her hand, threading their fingers together. What does your gut tell you? Nixura closed her eyes, reaching past the noise of competing obligations to find what she actually felt beneath it all. I think she's probably genuinely struggling. Prison is hard, and facing what she did is harder. But I also think she's spent her whole life manipulating people into giving her what she wants by performing vulnerability. I don't know how to tell the difference between real struggle and calculated performance. Then maybe that's your answer. You can support psychiatric evaluation without supporting sentence reduction. Tell the court you want her to receive mental health treatment, but you believe completing her sentence is necessary for accountability. It was the right answer, the one that honored both justice and compassion without sacrificing either. Nixura spent the rest of the afternoon drafting her statement, choosing words that were firm but not cruel, clear about boundaries without closing doors to future healing if Aloan ever did real work to change. She sent the statement at 6 that evening, copying both the prosecutor and Aloan's public defender, then closed her laptop and decided to stop thinking about her sister's choices. She'd done what she could to balance mercy and protection. The rest was up to the court and, ultimately, up to Aloan herself. The next morning brought news that Dorian's sentencing had been finalized. 15 years without possibility of parole, exactly what the prosecution had requested. Nixera read the headline over breakfast, feeling nothing beyond distant acknowledgement. Dorian was finished, his power dissolved, his ability to hurt people contained for at least the next decade and a half. How do you feel? Jean asked, watching her face for reaction. Nothing. I thought I'd feel satisfied or vindicated or something. But he's just a man who made terrible choices and now gets to live with consequences. That's not thrilling. It's just justice working the way it's supposed to. That's healthy. Is it? Shouldn't I feel something stronger? You already felt everything you needed to feel about him. The anger, the grief, the violation. You processed it and moved forward. This is just confirmation that your truth was believed, that the system worked for once. You don't have to perform emotional catharsis to prove anything. He was right, as usual. Nixera finished breakfast and moved on to the day's work, reviewing applications for the Gwangju shelter's staff positions, coordinating with architects about accessibility modifications, answering emails from donors and advocates and journalists who wanted updates on the foundation's progress. A week later, Nixera stood in Riverside Mall for the first time since Dorian had kicked her on the marble floor. The mall had changed in small ways, new stores replacing old ones, updated decorations attempting to mask the building's age. But the fountain was the same, the marble floors were the same, and standing here brought everything rushing back with unexpected intensity. Jean stood beside her, his presence grounding without being controlling. We don't have to do this. The plaque ceremony can happen without you. No. I want to be here. I need to be here. The mall management had approved the foundation's request to install a small memorial plaque near where the assault had occurred, a subtle acknowledgement of what had happened and what had been built from those ashes. The plaque itself was modest, bronze embedded in the marble, engraved with words Nixera had chosen carefully. In honor of survivors who transform pain into purpose. The Rosa Vale Foundation stands with you. The ceremony was small, just Nixera and Jean and a handful of foundation staff, along with a few journalists covering the event. No speeches, no performances, just Nixera kneeling beside the plaque and tracing her fingers over Rosa's name, feeling the weight of legacy and choice and survival settle like blessing rather than burden. As she stood to leave, a young woman approached, hovering nervously at the edge of the group. She looked familiar in the way all terrified Omegas looked familiar to Nixera now, that particular combination of hope and fear that came from reaching for help while expecting rejection. Are you her? The woman asked. The Luna? The one who started the foundation. I'm Nixera. I started the Rosa Vale Foundation, yes. I saw you at the opening. I was too scared to talk to you then, but I've been calling the hotline, working with the counselors. She took a breath, steadying herself. I left him 2 days ago. I took my daughter and I left, and now we're in the shelter, and I just wanted to say thank you for building something that caught us when we fell. Nixera felt tears prick her eyes, emotions swelling too large for her chest to contain. You're so brave. What you did, leaving, protecting your daughter, that takes more strength than most people ever find. I didn't feel brave. I felt terrified. Brave and terrified aren't opposites. Brave is doing the right thing even when you're terrified. You did that. You saved yourself and your daughter. That's everything. The woman left, escorted by one of the foundation's staff members back to the shelter where she was rebuilding her life one careful day at a time. Nixera watched her go, feeling the same sense of purpose she'd felt at the opening, the certainty that this work mattered more than anything else she might have chosen to do with her survival. "Ready to go home?" Seo-jin asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Yes, ready." They walked out of Riverside Mall together, leaving the plaque behind as a permanent reminder that suffering could be transformed, that justice was possible, that no one had to endure alone what Nixera had survived in isolation. The moon was rising over Riverside as they drove back to Seoul, full and bright, and following her home the way it always had, the way it always would, lighting paths for anyone brave enough to choose survival over surrender.